Hi everybody! I would like to share with you my favorite book. It's called Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. And I would like to share some pages with you.
Гарри Поттер и тайная комната.
Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Private Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a film called Grinnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy means fat, man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but also had a secret, and their greatest fear was somebody would discover it. They didn't think that they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Miss Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they haven't met for several years. In fact, Miss Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were an Undursley-ish, as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never ever seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing up with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little Tig," fluttered Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out to number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar: a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Private Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and he stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Private Drive. No looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards the town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of the town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat on the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people around. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed up in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw of young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see a couple of them weren't young at all. Why that man had to be older than he was and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve on him. But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably something silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in Grunning's car park. His mind back on the drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back on the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on the drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swooping past the broad daylight, though the people in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as an owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfect normal owl-free morning. He yelled at the 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, where he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He had forgotten about the people in clothes until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This lot was whispering excitedly too, as he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way past them, clutching a large donut in a bag. He got few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if he wanted to say something to them, but he thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his security not to disturb him, seized his telephone and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking no, he was beginning stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure that there were lots of people called Potter, but a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point worrying. Miss Dursley, she always got so upset if any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on the grills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked into the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made the passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who had gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around in the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted on the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever he was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car to set off home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped of before, because he didn't approve the imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he spotted the morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" Mr. Dursley said loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined to not mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had a nice normal day. She told him over dinner about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter. Now Dudley had learned a new word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went to the living room to catch the last reports on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere had reported that the nation's owls had been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newsreaders allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious, and now to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more shows of owls tonight, Jim? Well said the weatherman. I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers, as far as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks. But I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair, shooting stars all over Britain. Owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He had to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear? You haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in the town today. So, snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her a lot. Miss Dursley sipped off her tea through her pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared to tell her he heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as cautiously as he could, "Dear son, he's about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," said Miss Dursley stiffly. "What's his name again?" "Howard, isn't it?" "Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. "Yes, I quite agree." He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom in the window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Private Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it will go out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Private Drive. It didn't so much as a quiver when the car door slammed in the next street, nor when the 2 owls swooped overhead. It It was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner the cats had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched as its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen in Private Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which both were long enough to tuck in his belt. He was wearing long robes and a purple cloak which swept the ground, and a high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind the half-moon spectacles, and his nose were very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to boot was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he didn't seem to realize he was being still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He had found what he was looking for in his inside pocket. It seemed to be a silver chitrate lighter. He flicked it open, held it in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out into a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer until the lights left the whole street with 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which those eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of the window now, everything beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down in the Parliament. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back inside his cloak and set off down the street towards number 4, where he sat next to the cat. He didn't look at it. After a moment, he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, it was smiling at a rather serf-look woman who was wearing square glasses exactly the shape of markings the cat had around its eyes. She was too wearing a cloak and an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you had been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? When you could have been celebrating. I must have passed a dozen of feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh yes, everyone's celebrating. All right," she said impatiently. "You think they'd be a bit more careful, but no, even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked their head back at the Dursleys' dark living room. "I heard it. Flocks of owls shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something." Shooting stars down in Kent. I bet that the Digulus Diggle, he had never had much sense. You can't blame them, said Dumbledore gently. We've had a precious little to celebrate for 11 years. I knew that, said Professor McGonagall irritably. But that's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless on the streets in the broad daylight, not even dressed in muggle clothes. Swapping rumors. She threw a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he was going to tell her about something, but he didn't. So she went on. A fine thing it would be if, on the very day you know who seems to have disappeared, at last the Muggles found out all about us. I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore. It certainly seems so, said Dumbledore. We have much to be thankful for. Would you care about a sherbet lemon? A what? A sherbet lemon. The kind of muggle sweet. I'm rather fond on it. No, thank you, said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think she was the moment for sherbet lemons. And as I say, even if you know who has gone, my dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you know who nonsense. For 11 years I have been trying to produce people to call him by his proper name. Voldemort. Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking to sherbet lemons, seemed not to notice. It all gets so confusing when we keep saying you know who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name. I know you haven't, said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. But you're different. Everyone knows you know. Oh, all right, Voldemort was frightened of. You flatter me, said Dumbledore calmly. Voldemort has powers I will never have. Only because you're too noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she likes my new earmuffs. Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, the owls are nothing to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying? About why he's disappeared. About what finally stopped him. It seemed like Professor McGonagall had reached the point where she was most anxious to discover the real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day. Neither as the cat nor a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another sherbet lemon and did not answer. What they're saying, she pressed on, is that last night Voldemort turned up in Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor is that Lily and James Potter are that they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. Lily and James? I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. That's all, not all. They're saying he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how. But they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter. Voldemort's power somehow broke, and that's why he's gone. Dumbledore nodded gloomily. Is that true? Fluttered Professor McGonagall. After he's done, all the people he's killed, couldn't he kill a little boy? It's just astounding of all the things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess, and Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took the golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he had put it back into his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he told you I'd be here, by the way. Yes, said Professor McGonagall, and I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here. Of all the places, I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now. You don't mean? You can't mean the people who live here, cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us. And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up to the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here? It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter. A letter? Repeated Professor McGonagall, faintly sitting back down on the wall. Really, Dumbledore? You think you can explain all this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in future. There would be books written about Harry. Every child in our world would know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top to his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn away any boy's head. Famous before he can walk and talk. Famous before something he won't even remember. Can you see how much better off he will be growing up away from that until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth and changed her mind, swallowed it, then said, Yes, you're right, of course. But how's the boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak. Suddenly, as she thought he might be hiding in Harry underneath it, Hagrid's bringing him. You think it's wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly, but can't you pretend he's not careless? He just tend to... What was that? A low rumbling sound had broken into this silence around them. It grew steadily louder, and they looked up from the street on the sign of a headlight. It swelled to a roar, and both looked up in the sky, and a huge motorbike fell out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorbike was huge, it was nothing to the man sitting erased it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man, at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed and so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and a beard hid most of his face, but he had hands size of a dustbin lid, and his feet were their leather boots were baby dolphins. In his vast muscular arms he was holding a bundle of blankets. "Hagrid," said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. "At last. And where did you get that mocha by?" "Board it, Professor Dumbledore, sir," said the giant, climbing carefully off the motorbike as he spoke. "Young Sirius Black lent me it. I got him, sir." "No problems. Were they?" "No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him all out right before the Muggles started swarming around." He fell asleep as he was flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy fast asleep. Under a tuft of a jet black hair was over his forehead. They could see a curiously shaped cut like a bolt of lightning. "Is that where?" whispered Professor McGonagall. "Yes," said Dumbledore. "He's had that scar forever." "Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore?" "Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in useful. I have one myself above my left knee, which is perfect map for the London Underground." "Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'll better get this over with." Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned towards the Dursleys' house. Can I say goodbye to him, sir?" asked Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a very scratchy, viscous kiss. Then suddenly, Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. "Shh!" hissed Professor McGonagall. "You will wake the Muggles." Sorry," sobbed Hagrid, taking out a large spotted handkerchief and wearing it in his face. "But I can't stand it. Lily and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with Muggles." Yes, it's very sad, but get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we will be found," Professor McGonagall said, whispering Harry gingerly on the arm. As Dumbledore stepped over the low garden and wall and walked to the front door. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep and tucked it inside Harry's blanket, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the three of them stood and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously at the twinkling light usually shown by Dumbledore's eyes. Seems had gone out. "Well," said Dumbledore finally, "that's that. We've no business staying here. We may as well go and join the celebrations." "Yes," said Hagrid in a very muffled voice. "I best give this back away. Good night, Professor McGonagall." Professor Dumbledore, sir," wiping his streaming eyes on the jacket sleeve. Hagrid swung himself around the motorbike and kicked the engine to life. With a roar, it rose up in the air into the night. "I shall see you soon, I expect," Professor McGonagall said, and Dumbledore nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked down the street. On the corner, he stopped and took out the silver put-outer. He clicked once and 12 balls of the light speed put back to their street lamps so that private drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make a tabby cat slinkly around the corner at the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blankets on step number 4. "Good luck, Harry," he mumbled. He turned on his heel with a switch of his cloak. He was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Private Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky. The very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blanket without waking up. One small hand closed the letter beside him and slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he was woken in a few hours by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put the milk bottles, nor that she would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know that at this very moment, people meeting in the secret all over the country were holding their glasses and saying a hushed voice, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived." Hope you enjoyed Chapter 1. Bye!